Welcome everyone. I'm Catherine Veneman, Education Curator at the Blaffer Art Museum, and we are here to welcome you to our first in a series of 3 Master of Fine Arts Thesis Exhibition Gallery Talks. This is the 47th School of Art, UH School of Art MFA exhibition, and we're so proud to be hosting it once again. And this time we're going to have a series of 3 days of talks, and this is day 1. And we're fortunate that the moderator for this talk and facilitator is with me, Claudia Middleton Moreno, and I will give it over to her and welcome everyone and take it away.
Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for being here today on your lunch break. I appreciate you taking the time. I am delighted to introduce the 4 artists who are represented in the High Ceiling Gallery today. Beginning our artist gallery talks is Claude Durand. Claude is from Austin, Texas, graduated from Rhode Island School of Design with a master's and from University of Texas with a degree in design. They will be graduating from the University of Houston with an MFA in photography and digital media this spring. Everyone please welcome Claude.
Thank you all for being here. I'm just so happy with how everything is shaken out and the degree of talent on display, and everyone's so supported me in the process. I'd say I am an outsider to studio art. I have a background in design. My undergraduate is in design. And as I was going about the process of being a graphic designer, learning about user interfaces and design, advertising, and that sort of world, I was always drawn to the work that I saw being done, especially by studio arts MFAs at UT, the talent on display. And I wasn't exactly sure what the process was of being a studio artist. And I was always in the business as a designer of answering questions and finding solutions, practical solutions. And I kind of continued this process of investigation. I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and I got a master's in education. I had a lot of hands-on experience with every age from 5-year-olds some of whom did not speak English and had arrived from the Azores and only spoke Portuguese, to high schoolers who were 18 and going off to college. And that was also a matter of, in that process, learning how to serve others, developing confidence in myself. And it was only when I arrived here, I thought, okay, what am I gonna do with a studio arts master's? And the studio was where I kind of confronted myself and was confronted with these problems. The space, the studio space. And I was suddenly in a space where I didn't have questions to answer. I had to ask the right questions. And I think that is the big challenge of being an artist and a studio artist. And my first semester, I had to take a step back and reassess of what I wanted from my practice. Who was I, not as a designer or as a teacher or as a problem solver, but who was I as a person and what do I want to express when asking an open-ended question? And so I thought that can be my art therapy semester. And that never stopped. So it's been my art therapy MFA because I discovered very quickly that I wanted to ask emotional questions of myself, open-ended questions, discovering these cathartic processes of making art. And that's one of the powerful things, of course, about art as a means of self-expression. Sorry for tapping the mic. So as I came into the program, I entered with photography and I leave with photography, ? I have a persistent fascination with the work you see here with text as well as images. And one of my persistent fascinations is the trickiness of text and the trickiness of images, or maybe how slippery they are, because they are misleading. And I like that in a playful way in my work. So I started working in self-portraiture, taking different kinds of portraits and erasing or effacing parts of them, sort of create speculative selves or speculative personas as I was processing photos from my phone, from my daily experience. I removed myself from the large format camera because nothing I was taking on a large format camera was actually emotionally important to me. The photos I was taking every day on my phone were what was vivid and documenting my emotional experience. So all of the work here is phone-based photo media. And then the text that you see on these, I call them skins, these reclaimed and rehabbed nasty pieces of leather from the streets of Houston, from furniture that's being thrown away. The text that you see is poetry that I've written in various forms, and I emboss letter by letter with a hammer and jewelry stamps. And this very cathartic, very rhythmic, very performative sort of action that I'm beating these sort of feelings. And the photos and the images, the images and the words do share that common trickiness and playfulness, because I love to juxtapose various elements, various symbols. I don't think the viewer is meant to see themselves necessarily or see me clearly in these works. But what I do want them to see is the emotional through line of my experiences. And I like them to kind of work, I think of this almost as a crime scene. Maybe you've seen, in movies, the strings all over the walls. Connecting the dots is a very important part of the practice, because I think I'm processing these memories in a nonlinear fashion, as often happens when you look back on life. And I want to present them in a nonlinear way. And I think as people move around and among these works, as you crouch down, as you look from one to the next, you form your own interesting threads or connections between the pieces, and these emotional gems or these little parts that catch will stick out to you and form your own connections of meaning. And I'm interested in the multiplicity of meanings because my work is extremely personal. It is extremely autobiographical and vulnerable, and in the poetry and in the photos, I think very squarely document a lot of difficult experiences for myself. But what I want people to take away from that is not so much a complete picture, so much as it is their own significance between the information I present. So maybe I've started asking the right questions because they have so many answers. There's as many answers as there are ways to move around these pieces. And that's especially why I was drawn to get away from the wall and into the sculptural format, into the round, to engage people, because I think when we engage text flat on a page, or we engage photos flat on a wall or our phone, we have a normal way of looking and relating. And I want us to challenge that normal way of looking. I want little kids to be crawling on the ground next to this artwork and looking at it a different way than you would if you moved clockwise or counterclockwise. Okay. Around how's time? 5 minutes? And so I'll go a little further into some of the significance of the works for me, some of my influences when it came to developing the process. As I said, I have a graphic design background, and one of the fortunate experiences I had in graphic design was in letterpress. Letterpress, as you've probably seen, it involves metal letters and paper and ink going over the metal letters. And it's a machine that rolls and presses the letters into the paper. And I had a lot of experience with letterpress, which was maybe my first experiments with combining photography and text and creating my own hand-set sort of poems. And when it came to this, letterpress is a very controlled and precise process about balancing the pressure with your text. I wanted something that would allow me to work much more gesturally almost, or much more instinctively. And that's when the idea of having stamps that are much cheaper than a lead jewelry piece and harder, that can take the pressure of hammering, repeated hammering came in. And along the way, because I've worked with the same set of stamps, a single alphabet, for almost 3 years now, as you put pressure on these pieces through hammering, sometimes too much force, they start to deform a little bit. And so I've almost created my own unique alphabet, and you can sort of age the pieces archaeological-wise from some of the newest to the oldest based on the resolution of the letters. So this piece that you see here, the series that we have here is a triptych of multiplicity, is a triptych called Skins, Skins 1, 2, 3. Skins are the name I give to these pieces because for me, skin, the leather stands in so naturally for my own body and the bodies of others, and sort of the body that carries these memories. To me, it's a lot more loaded than paper, like plain white paper. I like to stretch the pieces and put a lot of tension on them and activate their position within these frames. These are reclaimed industrial frames that I've also salvaged and polished to be in presentable order. And in the process of putting these pieces together, I thought of as people moving around this space and starting in a lightly chronological order, but not making people stick to that chronological order. The pieces themselves have a variety of mixed media techniques for applying photographic imagery. I started with editing and effacing in digital prints, and I was told very often my digital prints look a lot like paintings, and I wanted to take that even further by creating a photo experience that doesn't look like a photo at a first glance, maybe not even a second glance. And so I started abstracting a lot of the forms through very lossy methods of applying the photos to my mediums. So there's mixed media of laser, and the laser cutter kind of burns in images, very kind of sort of violent but still precise way of engaging the surface. There is gel transfer, which is coating the photo with acrylic, and I actually hand tint the back of those because they're all black and white photos. So the things that look a little more like a typical photo in the pieces are gel transfer. I hand tint them. Photography has a very long history of hand embellishing and hand painting, especially portraiture, dating back to the first daguerreotypes that I wanted to embrace. There's also stenciling in various means. I was inspired by a lot of pre-lithography techniques. There's a French stenciling technique called pochoir that was used for illustrating like cheap storybooks and advertising in the early 19th century. So there is cut or laser paper stencils based on photographic images as well. And so all in all, I'd say I'm never satisfied with just one image, even on one piece. I like the aggregation, this sort of layered palimpsest or layered, like so many images and meanings accumulate that they start to erode each other. I'm very interested in these ideas. I began thinking of how to install these ideas. Originally, I was thinking of like a gravestone type situation with a concrete base, because I felt like these are almost like, if you go to a gravesite, you know, you'll see the biographical information of a person, and it kind of sums up the person. And I wanted to, okay, if we're putting a sum to my experiences that another person can access, it's sort of like that frozen dead self that someone can access. But also, it's not as simple as, you know, name, date, engraved on a piece of marble. I wanted to create a very dynamic architecture that would still serve sort of as a memorial to myself.
Great, thank you so much, Claude. Thank you for your words. I would be delighted to open it up to questions from the audience. I'll get the ball rolling. I have a question myself. I feel like what you said about text and images being very slippery really stuck out to me. And then it contrasts with your decision to use letterpressing, which is really fixed, very permanent, and you can't make any changes. I was wondering if you just had any more thoughts about why is text slippery? What makes it so?
Because text is our workhorse, and text is our definition in the dictionary. And it's like, can you put a word to an experience, or can you write it down? And once you write it down to a fixed form, it sort of becomes fixed in your memory. I'm inspired by, there's a lot of work with psychology and how people process trauma and process events. And one of the therapeutic techniques is writing out events. And they found that that helps people stick to a concrete version of what happened, instead of worrying about the various possibilities of what could have happened in the memory. And I thought, your actual memory changes once you write something down. Once you write down how you feel about a thing or what actually happened, your memory will start to conform itself. And so that very fixed text is such a powerful thing to put in there, because you're sort of declaring what happened. And I kind of sidestep that because my poetry is full of puns and plays on words and kind of meandering back and forth in images, but not necessarily a clear timeline of here is exactly what I'm describing. Because to me, I'm trying to preserve not like a factual timeline, but an emotional impression. So me, I am putting concretely down a very clear, resolved emotion, but not necessarily the events themselves.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? I'll repeat them for the benefit of the camera. What's your special image? What's an image that impacted you the most?
What's a special image? I'd have to think maybe chronologically because I began the practice of self-portraiture, and I would think, thinking about which images are in here. There's a small image located on the back of this one, and if you come around, you'll see it's me upside down. And I think that was one of those images that I was taking was one of the first images I was taking as I was exploring my own gender and what I wanted for myself. I was sort of taking on these performances and documenting them. So before the camera, like trying different poses. In the series that's upstairs, I have 2 long poems, and I was playing around with text, image recognition algorithms that would describe what is happening in a photo of myself. And it might say something as ridiculous as, this is a red leaf in the snow, or it would say, this is a woman standing before a colored wall, or this is a man standing before a calendar, that sort of thing. And I was putting on these performances, and I think by engaging who I was in a performance space before the camera took a lot of pressure off of like, okay, the camera is seeing me in these ridiculous subjective ways. I think people are also seeing me in ridiculous subjective ways. So that the role that those photos played for me personally would be the largest.
I just want to say I think it's a very beautiful symbolism that you use leather and how it's like bits and pieces. Because like throughout life we all transform in different ways. I think it's a very beautiful symbolism that you use in a very creative way.
Thank you.
And I like, because like I met you like earlier this year and I didn't know you did graphic design. That's cool.
Thank you. I gave you, I think we talked a little bit about design. So I did have some qualification to give you advice, at least. Other questions?
We have time for one more question, 2 more.
Where do I see the practice going, says Alex. I think the words have become even more important to me as the practice has developed of writing about my experiences as they happen. And my practice right now, because it was so transformed by having a space, having a studio space. And now I'm planning on, after graduating, traveling full-time in a trailer for a little while, which is to say not having a space to make 12-foot-high sculptures. The leather is relatively lightweight to make on the go, but I'm thinking about how do I continue processing myself and how I'm engaging with the world. And to me, continuing the phone documentation, continuing words. Alex and I, we were both in Nantes in France together, and when I was there, I had a preview of this because I realized I can't take anything back from France that I wouldn't want to ship. And so while there, I started making interactive web books and web experiences that combine image and text. And I think I'm going to continue playing with that because that's accessible for anyone, anywhere, and doesn't require me to carry around art supplies.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Claude, for speaking about your work.
Thank you.
I am very, very pleased to welcome Kaima Marie Akarue as our next artist speaker. Kaima is from Houston, Texas. She's a local. She has a master's in counseling, and she will graduate from the University of Houston with her MFA in painting. Welcome, Kaima.
And kudos to Claudia for saying my name impeccably well. I kind of want to start there. Growing up in Houston, I'm half white, half Nigerian, and so that's kind of the basis of a lot of the work in the beginning. Trying to figure out what that means growing up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Hispanic and Black, and then constantly negotiating who I was, right? People super curious, they mean well, right? But me having to figure out who I was at such a young age, but not really having the language to describe what that meant. Fast forward, I had some babies, and then I had to find a way to help them navigate their own story, right? And to me, I was wondering, how do I help them figure out who they are if I didn't know who I was? And so the basis of the work stands from me really trying to discover my own identity. So 2019, my mom passed away. That was the catalyst for me to really pursue art in this format. I came into this program as a painter. I have not painted all 3 years at all. But I do think that my foundation in painting has been a substantial, tool in how I carve out space and environment in my collage work. So when I start doing collage, I think about, how do I figure out how to express myself in a way that makes sense to all of the different factors and variables of who I am. And collage just made sense. So even when I painted, there was this level of distortion that was happening, and I think that that's the thread that continues on throughout the work, even when I was painting and now into collage. I like to call my work photography adjacent, because in the beginning I was using a lot of archival imagery, and as I developed on, I'm using more and more of my own photography, old family photos, stock photos. And so at the beginning of my thesis, I called it, "It was never my intention." It was never my intention to be an artist. Just like Claude, I don't come from a studio practice. I went to school to become a journalist, visited New York my freshman year of college, and decided I never want to live here, ever. Great place to visit, don't want to live here. And then I decided to start teaching. I've been an educator for 15 years, taught journalism, communication, and now I teach graphic design. Got my master's in counseling because feelings, wanted to help people. And then decided, you know what, none of this is making sense, none of this clicks with me. Got to go back to school. And so here we are, and it's been a very interesting transition in my career, and I think that it is one that is impactful and pivotal. So I wanted to start that as the foundation for this particular thesis. When I do my work, I like to think that I create in a triad. Interior spaces, exterior spaces, and transitive spaces. And I think that I approach all of that work in different ways. In my interior spaces, I feel like they are more aspirational. It's a mixture of things that have exist. It's an idea of preserving story, narrative. When I'm approaching exterior spaces, I think of those spaces as more of a documentarian. I'm taking things that already exist and recalibrating what they mean with all of the ingredients of past, present, and future. And then when I approach my transitive pieces, these are neutralizing spaces for identity. You know, when we're on any kind of transportation, like a subway, for instance, it neutralizes who we are. We all have someplace to go, and you know, we've all been somewhere, right? It's a space where we all have different ideologies, right? We're all different genders, all different classes, and it's just a space that crystallizes that. And so I think that when I approach this particular work downstairs, because upstairs is different. Upstairs has my exterior pieces and my transitive pieces, but here was a breakthrough. As you can see, if I start on this section here, this was the first time that I used one particular person in all of the work. And it's really, gosh, I'm a crier, y'all. And Venus is in retrograde, so that's typically what happens for me. So when I started to develop this story, I had some of my influences like Deanna Lawson, Nona Faustine, Carrie Mae Weems, and I started thinking about fleshing out a story using one person, and what does that look like when that story is about that particular person, and when that story becomes a person who is a vessel for all women. And that's where this particular series came to be. I want you to approach it as preserving story, preserving time, memory, and those particular tools, because those are very important for me. And then when I come to these works over here, I think it is another break in my work because I have softer lines. A lot of my lines are very angular, very sharp, kind of like shards of glass. And I like to think of memory and time as tools and materials that I use to really flesh out, because I think that memory is fluid. We all have these distorted ideas of what has happened in the past and what currently is here. And so when I think about how I approach this particular work with the fabric, I want you to think about fabric as not just a three-dimensional material, but a symbol. And it is I hadn't gotten there yet. You're just manifesting it. I thought I did good. Okay. So I want you to think of fabric as a symbol, symbol of domestication, symbol of womanhood. And I think that all of these pieces down here is more of a reclamation of women, taking up space, looking at space as a moment of fatigue, but also a moment of survival. And so a lot of my work isn't overtly political, but I think being a woman of color, my work will always be political. And so I feel like I'm not gonna keep talking, I'd rather take questions.
Let's do some snaps and the transition to questions. Let's open it up. I know there are people specifically who came to ask you some questions about your work, so I'm gonna let them do that.
Okay.
Mind if I start?
Sure.
So your latest work focuses on these interior spaces and then thinking about like working with a single figure. Moving forward, are you going to continue with that, like working with the same figure?
The same figure, or you mean like?
Either the same or maybe a different person, but one single person.
I think I really enjoyed what that experience did for me, but also the experience did for my muse, my model, who is actually here today, and I want to put her on. It's coming. It's your fault. It's not a good talk unless I cry. I'm a crybaby. But I think that what she offered was still a vessel that felt autobiographical, right? It was an opportunity to explore narrative that maybe I wasn't so brave to explore on my own. Literally, every single talk I make, I cry. Okay, move on.
In the process of working with your model / muse, what was the collaboration like? Did the model shape any of the direction you took with the poses or with the tone?
If I'm being frank, I think that I probably blindsided her. She knew that she was going to be a part of the work. She had no clue how many pieces. I didn't either. I thought it was going to be a one-off. It ended up being 5. I approached her. I told her who was influencing my direction, and she was for it. She came opening night, and it was the first time she had ever laid eyes on the work. And so, yes, I think that the narrative took itself, right? And I think that I was more impacted as I started working by just the experience of piecing things together and realizing the barriers that I'm breaking by exploring this type of work, this specific person, this specific scene that, required space, required highlighting. Yeah, I think that when I'm creating work, it is both contextual, but also just aesthetically how I am driven, right? My work is very intuitive. I like to think that I'm anointed, like the ancestors are guiding my moves. I'm not planning these beforehand. Even if I have a muse, literally it's just, this is my muse, start putting pieces together. And so the idea of black and white imagery mixed with color imagery, I think, is this opportunity to play with how memory works, right? And how time works. And so I think that a lot of times it allows for the work to stay in the moment versus in the past versus in the present, future. I like to think that there is a relationship that's happening between past and present, not necessarily future. I don't think that my work talks to the future as much as it has the conversation of present and past. And I think that when I am mixing black and white imagery with colored imagery, it is a painterly thing that I'm doing. I'm actually looking at the colors of it and how the chemistry is working together. So I think contextually it's working, but also I'm looking at it as just aesthetically, how is this working in the composition? Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question, Kaima.
You spoke of composition. How does it come about?
How does composition come about? I think that I am building from the inside outwardly. A question I get asked often is how long does one of these pieces take? And I can't really answer that. I think I'm working on multiple pieces at once. And so I have center segments that I'm building, and then I have just sky segments that I'm building. And I think that the whole idea is to create a kinetic energy that's happening. I want there to be movement. And so as I'm building out my compositions, I am working until something feels resolved. And so I think that, what happens when I'm working from inside out is this really irregular perimeter, these very specific shapes that are never planned in the beginning, they just kind of end like that. And I want the idea that it can still expand beyond those spaces where I choose to stop the narrative. So the information is still there and the idea is that it is expansive and it keeps going. I think that definitely storytelling, I think that that's what I'm doing. I also think that it's a part of my practice. There is this, like I said, my practice is very intuitive when I'm working, but in order to keep going, there has to be a part of it where I am stepping back and reflecting. And that requires reading, and that requires writing. And those things are necessary for me to continue and create this momentum and motion that takes me to the next piece. I think that I'm heavily inspired by text. Always. I think words, text are my first love. And then I think I am thinking of a visual that coincides with whatever that information or trope that I'm trying to capture. I think it just comes about in a naturally organic, those are the same word, way.
Kaima, are there any final remarks you'd like to make?
No, I might add this to Abby's table. No,
Well,
so
thank you so much. We really appreciate you and your words. Sajeela is going to start talking just a little bit about her work. She's from Pakistan and she moved to Providence, Rhode Island when she was a teenager. She has studied both business and design and operates on the intersection of both. And she will be earning an MFA in painting from the University of Houston this spring. She'll speak just a little bit about her work, and then she would prefer to have an extended question and answer period. So be thinking about what kinds of questions you have for the artist. Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah. It's like I haven't had enough questions yet after having my thesis defense this morning. Yeah, so it's funny how like Kaima and Claude before me, I also don't come from a studio practice. We all have a master's in something else from before. So mine is in business. So I studied business, and then I figured that I will go back and ask an MBA advisor what I can do to get a CPA certification. And so I was chatting with her, and she goes, what about graphic design? And I was like, wait, what? And then she goes, whenever you say the word design, your eyes light up. And so I went to the art department to start taking some design classes, and then they told me that I needed to take some foundation classes like drawing, et cetera, which made me lose sleep for a week because I thought I couldn't draw. So yes, so I got another bachelor's in graphic design. And so I was taking a lot of photography classes where I had some environmental portrait assignments. So while I was doing drawing, I started drawing those portraits. So my journey to figure has been very organic. It started, with photography, and from there to drawing, and then from there to painting when I came here. And so when I started working on this one, this is the first of the 6 that I started focusing towards the thesis. So I took the picture in that pose because another one of my double major is in communication, and we used to study a lot about how people of different cultures hold their bodies in a different manner, Eastern, Western, closed off, direct, indirect, subtle, etc. And so I would notice that in Pakistani gatherings, women, it's almost like code switching. So they would sit in a different manner compared to how they are out operating their usual life, taking their children to school like everybody else and all that. And I always wondered about that for years before starting to develop that idea into a painting. So I took the picture, and then I decided that I needed an environment for it that can't really be very specific, like an actual living room where they are. I needed it to be more of in-between space, in between outdoors, indoors, also vague in terms of the time period. Is she a traveler? Is she resting for a moment? Is she just passing through time, space, all of that? So I constructed the space around it. It took me a few months to just go through a few iterations, and I started the painting, and it was a lot of trial and error in terms of figuring out how to make the space look like it's the space that she actually is part of. And the funny thing is that starting with this and then working through the rest of them, I figured out that process is how I am learning how to paint figure. And so the process of how to put down paint layer after layer after layer, especially because these are in oil and it's a medium meant for layering. After a lot of experimentation, I learned a lot of things, some mistakes, some things to do, what to carry on to the rest of the work, and what not to do in the rest of them. And from there, I switched to that one. I also like painting very different things, one after the other, because I kind of get bored because I go at it with such intensity that I needed to just do something very, very different. And I also like challenging myself in terms of the color, just the medium itself that I'm tackling. So that picture, when I took it, it had a lot of what we consider white, right? White hair, white t-shirt, white skin, and the ground behind the figure was also white. But it transitioned. I ended up, putting in more color than what I started out thinking that I was going to. But the process of painting, changed a lot with that one. I started painting less with brushes and a lot more with paper towels, and I just rubbed the paint into the canvas. I raised it, rubbed it, put down more, took off, and it's just it allowed for softer edges and just softer transitions. You can see there's some harder edges in this figure still, although I was already starting to move to a softer feel, but it really progressed in that one. And then from there, I moved to that one, and again, quite a bit of departure in terms of values of colors, and also another environment that I constructed around the figure to enhance that sense of dreaminess. Whether we wonder, is it just how real is it? What is reality? You can get a little feel of that there's something a little different about the space and the figure, but what exactly is it? And it allows for a slower look at the painting. Hopefully the viewer can stay in front of it a little longer and just ponder the presence of the figure, which is what they're all about. It's just about being. Yeah. Questions?
That was beautiful. Let's open it up. What questions do we have about the work? Yeah.
Can you talk about the gazes of your subjects? I'm noticing that everybody except the blue
Yeah.
are looking very directly at the
Most of all her, my fabulous model Hannah right there. Actually, two of the models are here, Erica and Hannah. Yes, it's. I didn't intend for that to happen. Most of the pictures I took of him were of him looking at me. This was actually an accidental shot. I just took it while I was testing the light, and it's just that he seemed. His power comes not from the gaze, it seemed to come from not caring about the world. Is there even a world, right here, while he's in there? It doesn't matter what's here that we are looking at him, and it just seems so serene and so peaceful, which is also, I feel like something, not that I'm an expert on males, but this just feels like that's, in America especially, for male of color is like a tougher subject to handle, that serenity, that peacefulness. So I figured if I can't stop looking at it, then hopefully others can't either.
I have a question regarding to the subject regarding the bag, and as such as you went to the right context and regarding to that would be added into it.
The
Context of the tote bag.
Yeah, the tote bag.
Yeah. So one of the things in all of them was I'm trying to avoid any strong symbols or signs because they become sort of culturally specific or somehow geared towards one culture or another or people of one language or another. So I wanted to keep them as open as possible. So as it was quite open, but it felt like something was missing. And I kept thinking, should I have a bottle of water or some shoes or something? What do I do to have that extra thing? Because it just felt like it needed something. And that's a Barclay Hendricks painting, and I've had that bag for a while. I got it from one of his retrospective shows. And it was just there, and I was just looking at it, and I thought, I already had the idea of her maybe being a traveler, passing through, resting, in a transitional space somewhere. So I thought it fit with that. And although it kind of fights that my own idea of being, not having strong symbols, but it is a strong symbol, it's a painting. But because it served the needs of the painting, I chose to just make that exception. Yeah. Any other questions?
I had a composition question. I mean, you already touched
Yeah.
on how you come up with compositions, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what is your thought process as you're going through all these photos that you've taken? What are some of like the things that you're looking for when you're trying to settle on a final composition?
It's piece by piece first. Because I do go through sometimes multiple compositions. For instance, that one gave me a lot of trouble. I cannot tell you how many different versions. So I use Adobe Fresco to place the figure and then just draw around it, different, ideas, palettes, lighting, all of that, and trying to make it as cohesive with the figure so that it doesn't look unnatural. But also, it's not that I have any kind of narrative. I try to avoid that so that it's not restricting me in some way. I don't want to tell a story at all. It's simply how will the composition work, right? So looking for a composition for the sake of only the composition, just for the formal elements, not in terms of, not in service of a narrative or anything. Rick and I talked a lot about that chair, whether I needed the chair or not. And I told him I needed the chair because until I put the chair in there, it felt like he was floating in front of a TV. So that's how that came about. Yeah, and then with this one, this is the first one where I am making up the environment, right? So how do I find what to put in there? It's because of the drawings, like the drawing that's by the stairs. It's that side of my practice, the abstract work. It's a lot of architectural elements, windows, stairs, arches. And so I was like, of course, if I'm making something up, then I have to pull from there, and it has to be stairs, definitely, window, definitely. And then instead of an arch, though, I went with a column because everyone, while I was working on it, was saying, oh, how Eastern it is, and I wanted to disrupt that. So I wanted to throw in a Western style column. So as confusing as possible. Yeah. Any other questions?
I wonder, when you made the change, I'm thinking about what you said about going to paper towels as your tool for this portrait. Did that tell you anything about the figure? Like, through the process that you were changing, did you have any revelations that you could share with us?
About the figure, yes. It has a lot to do with, I had to learn to restrain myself a lot, especially with him because he is a child. But because he was squinting, he had all these lines, but I knew if I put them down, they would be more like wrinkles of an older person. So I had to restrain myself as to how much should I put down, which is usually against any tendency that I have. I'm more of a maximalist. I put down everything I see. But with the help of a paper towel, so a lot of the times I use paper towel when I know that with a brush I will get bogged down into the little tiny details, whereas I'm forcing myself to stay softer and more vague with how much I put down or how defined it can be. Yeah.
I think we have time for one quick question, if anyone has something interesting, fun.
Anything about the drawings?
Yes, will you speak about the drawings just briefly, because we don't know anything about them.
Yeah, so there's one drawing in the show right now. It's hanging by the stairs. That is the abstract side of my brain. It is minimal in color. Sometimes it's such a relief from painting itself, from painting representational work. It just really helps to balance both. And also, I mean, you can take me out of business school, but you can't take business school outside of me. And it's just the technical side of me that comes out more in that way. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
Hello again, welcome back. Before we introduce our final artist, I also want to invite everyone here to next week's Artist Talks. We're going to hear from Abby Edmondson, Hannah Binder, and Daniel Zamora in the Low Ceiling Gallery. It's at the same time, and we would love to see you here. So, without further ado, Alexandra Lechin is a Venezuelan-American interdisciplinary artist working in sculpture, performance, and emerging media. Her work examines identity, materiality, and cultural memory, often through movement and spatial interventions. She studied at Beaux Arts Nantes in France and holds a BFA in sculpture. Lechin will receive an MFA in IPEF, Interdisciplinary Practices and Emerging Forms, from UH this spring. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hi, everyone. So this is a very different outcome than I was expecting for my thesis. As Claudia mentioned, my background is in sculpture, but leading up to starting my MFA, I was very heavily involved in fabrication and creating immersive spaces. The involvement of the viewer was very important in my work, and that kind of started to lend itself to me starting to explore more conceptual themes. So at the beginning of the 2 years of my thesis, I was doing a lot more performance work, community engaged practices, and doing things that involved more people. And as the thesis show approached, I began to want to return to objects and object making and production. Previously, my work focused a lot on an optical illusion called moire, which happens when two grids of lines interact and create a visual vibration. But with that, I wanted to kind of explore more perceptual phenomenologies and look more specifically at visual disabilities and learning disabilities that kind of had a aesthetic outcome or an aesthetic output. So I focused for the thesis show on a particular type of visual impairment through dyslexia called rivers. And it occurs primarily when there is double-space justified text, and the white spacing in between the letters tends to become exaggerated and create this river effect. I highlighted it and turned it into the subject of the work. Along the hallway on the other side of this wall is a poem that I wrote in English, but have translated into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And through the structure and the grammatical structure of the poems, the negative spacing in between those words created like its own unique pattern that I then turned into the subject for these works. There is a theme of repetition in my work because at the early years, my practice was a way to self-soothe. I have a background as well in psychology and had hopes of doing art therapy, but at the time it was more about how my practice can help myself overcome personal anxiety, panic attacks, what have you. And there's something very satisfying to me about having a small act that accumulates into a larger final outcome. So in Rivers, it's just 1/4-inch round bar that has been just sliced and is very rigid and stacked, welded to create what looks like redacted text, but is actually the negative spacing that is being highlighted. And brought to the forefront as the main focus. And here the repetitive action is present in the fabrication and the assembly of the piece. So the work is composed of a total of 200 pounds of clay, so it's 100 pounds of porcelain, and 100 pounds of obsidian clay, which works red, and when it's put through the kilns and fired, turns to obsidian, this black color. And the repetitive process of hand cutting all of these tiles and getting them fired and placed is it's a very happy place for myself to be in, to just know that this is what I'm doing. This repetitive act kind of brings me stability or purpose, if you will, and is reminiscent of the travels that I did while I was in Europe. I spent some time in Portugal, and a lot of the cobbled roads tend to look like this. It's a very traditional form of creating the roads, because they're all dry fit together. There's no concrete holding these streets together. It's just all hand chiseled pieces of black and white stone that over time, with people moving over it and carriages and cars, kind of start to shift out of place, which I thought was quite beautiful. And I'm thinking about a lot of different things at the same time. Like, I'm also coming out of making a lot of video work and working a lot in like the new media space. I'm thinking of like physically touching and manipulating pixels and creating what is to me like its own language almost. I'm thinking the black and white helps me kind of circle back around to the binary, like the positive and negative, and playing with the notion of nothingness and somethingness. And kind of bouncing back those same ideas here as well. Like the shadows playing with the pieces are exaggerating or kind of highlighting the distortion of reading text with dyslexia. And quite frankly, I notice now my one regret of installation of the pieces. I think I should have switched these. To give this one a little bit more space to highlight the shadows and highlight the interplay of the light with the actual object. I feel like I just blew right through that. Hold on, let's pull out my notes. Oh yeah, the printed works too with the poem and highlighting kind of the similarities with the languages. I fluent in Spanish and French adjacently, and experiencing Portuguese, there was this kind of like happy world happening in my head where there was ways of understanding what was going on without really knowing the language because of the cadence or the rhythm of what's being said. So in the poems and those prints, you can see that even though it's saying the exact same thing, the way that the text is structured, it creates a different rhythm, and being able to express the same idea with using completely different, what looked like compositions to me of the text. Like I start treating the text not as text and what's being said, but as the actual material, starts to kind of get lost into this sea of optic lines and creating what look like topographies now. You know, like these spaces can be cities, they can be landscapes, they can be worms even. But seeing where this can go from here there's a lot of possibilities in terms of the application of this subject, but yeah, returning to something that was more hands-on was kind of the challenge that I gave myself with this thesis. Returning to a place of solidarity in the studio and not, separating myself from the community to get back into creating objects was the main transition, and creating an opportunity for the viewer to experience the work in whichever way that they consume it is, I guess, the final outcome or the objective. Am I good on time? Good? Okay. Any questions? Yeah, so in this, there's still kind of like the limit of like the page, right? And like the different pages of text that that come from blocked text. Here I do kind of like explode that notion and kind of like take the subject out of this rectangular square space, and it becomes more freeform. I do wish to expand that notion, but there's something very freeing about the limitations of the rectangle and keeping things in that format. But yeah, potentially going forward, yeah.
So would that then also change the shapes, because these are from the reductive spaces, right? But then now that you're leaving the page behind with that, would that change the shapes too?
Yeah, it would, it could, like applying it to the idea of them maybe mimicking like a cityscape or mimicking a mountain range. Being able to use that patterning to kind of start to represent other ideas as well, or even sound too. Starting to think about how these works can also be read in like a performative sense, like being able to, because I've performed my poetry in the past, but how does the empty space in between sound? You know, how does that start to translate, and how is it received as well?
I'm kind of curious about the composition of the height of the space and the stacking of those. If you could talk about that a little bit.
So I knew that I definitely wanted to use the height of the space. Originally, there was going to be, my ambition for the piece was that there was going to be 16 panels, but based off of the output, I didn't take into account shrinkage of the pieces. When installing it, I was aware that they were going to go all the way to the top, but the scattered composition of it was basically me trying to meet this height while maintaining a column. I did not take into account the vent at the top, but you know, it's there now. But I like the idea of like this motion upward, of like the head having to go up and giving this kind of like monolithic feel. No one in particular, but I really appreciate the way that Joan Jonas uses text in her performances as well, kind of like the rhythm behind the way that she speaks her words. And I like the immediacy of creating words. I mean, for my thesis paper, I wrote the entire thing on a typewriter just because I enjoyed the rhythm of it. And I mean, even now, because of my use of text, I have professors that are just like, oh, you should make books. And I'm like, the object, or the purpose is sculpture. But, you know, coming back and creating books and making printed material is something that I think will start to show more in my practice. Just because the written word as an object to me is really fascinating.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Alexandra.
everyone.